Assalamu alaikum. Good evening, brothers and sisters. Today we have a guest from University of Oxford, Britain, Adeel Malik. Welcome, Professor. This is an honor for us to host you here in Istanbul, in IKAM. Today's topic is social justice from the perspective of Islam. The current manifestations around the issue of social justice in the Muslim world. And Professor Malik is an expert on this area. He is in Istanbul for another conference, Ibn Khaldun conference, organized by Ibn Khaldun University, and we invited him for another lecture in IKAM, and he joined us. This is an opportunity for us to listen him in IKAM because we believe that the main focus of Islamic economics is increasing the level of social justice, the application of social justice in all areas in the world and in the Muslim societies. And today we'll listen to him for 45 minutes. He prefers it to be an open lecture, open debate. For that reason, we give high priority for your questions and comments after the lecture. And we will give another 30 minutes for your questions. The ground is yours, Professor. Thank you for your attendance.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here finally. We have been in contact for quite some time, and although I was in Istanbul for another conference, to be honest, and I hope people in Ibn Khaldun University are not hearing this. This is what I was really looking forward to. It was a great occasion for me to prepare for this and read a lot of books. So it acted what economists would call a commitment device. What I'm going to do today is to provide a few leads or discussion points so that we could have more interactive session on social justice. And the idea would be to present to you the thoughts of an outsider. And I would say an outsider because I'm not trained in the tradition of, Islamic economics and finance as such. I started my career as an economist, and I'm an empirical economist based at the University of Oxford. And then at Destiny Had It, I was offered a position in the fellowship, a Globe Fellowship in the Economies of Muslim Societies. And I joined the Center for Islamic Studies, and they said, well, you'll have to do a bit of work on Islam and on the Middle East. And I said, I have very multidisciplinary interests. I would be happy to do that. So over time, I have worked a great deal on political economy of Muslim societies, particularly the Middle East. And I'm now interested in the larger question of the moral and political economy of Islam. So I do not claim that I have the requisite religious knowledge to speak on this subject, nor this sort of rigid and scientific knowledge on Islamic economics and finance. So treat this as a conversation from somebody who's still learning in this area. Great. Well, I think we can get started. Before that, I will quickly give you a brief background of where I'm coming from. I've recently edited a book which is coming out in a month's time from the Oxford University Press. It's called Crony Capitalism in the Middle East, Business and Politics from Liberalization to the Arab Spring. And it basically develops different empirical perspectives on how business and politics are combined. So you will see some of my ideas, especially the way I link them with social justice. And I'm also writing an introductory text. Oxford University Press has a series called The Very Short Introduction to Islamic Finance. A very short introduction. It has very short introduction to almost everything, to religion, to Islam, right? science subjects. So this is the first series they're doing on Islamic finance. So it's just a 30,000 word book, an introduction, very preliminary introduction. But what I'm doing in this is adding a chapter on moral and political economy of Islam. And so some of the work that I've been doing in preparation of this lecture was around that. So the ideas I'm going to present, you might find them slightly fragmented and not fully structured, but they are basically ideas for us to debate and some insights on this subject. If you read stuff on social justice, there is, of course, the material on social justice that you would find from John Rawls to, a lot of other, John Stuart Mill, a whole range of philosophers, Amartya Sen until recently, Michael Sandel, right? These are people who have written about justice, right? What is fairness? What is equity? How do you align the distributional needs of society with the inherent differences across individuals, right? Some are rich, some are poor, people have different endowments. How do you really engage with those differences and create a relatively equal society? There are also large accounts in Islamic studies on justice. If you talk to a religious scholar, they would say, well, social justice or justice in a very broader sense is the core evaluative principle of Islam, right? Because it's, this one of the main objectives of our religion is to create justice within society, right? How do you create a just and a morally upright society? It's the very basic mission of the religion. But what I want to do is take you through a slightly more personal and different trajectory in thinking about these ideas, which partly come from my background, but also in terms of the intellectual trajectory that I've taken. I want to start with a little story, and the story of this guy called Abdul Jalil, who's an African American in Berkeley. And he went to one of the very few African Americans who went to the University of Berkeley at a time when very few people were admitted. There was a lot of racism at that time. I'm talking really about 60 years ago. And he became, he started an entrepreneurship company, and he started helping big, kind of basketball players, football players. A lot of them were African Americans. And it's a story about him who, if you were to visit on an ordinary day, especially after Friday prayers, you will see that he comes in a big van, and he parks the van outside the mosques, and immediately after the mosque opens the van, and there is free food, right? So a lot of free food. And he basically takes food that is going to expire in 3-4 days, 5 days, perishable food, and he distributes to different communities. It's very difficult to talk to him because he's always constantly busy. And I first noticed him when I came to this event that ILM organized in Konya. And on the sidelines, this event was on Perspectives on Islam and Social Justice. And on the sidelines of the event, I, of course, saw Mevlana Rumi's place. I saw Sadruddin Konvi's place. And I also went to Shams Tabrizi. And going through those places, I was thinking, what would be a modern equivalent of a Sufi saint? And lo and behold, 2 weeks later, for a conference, I ended up in Berkeley. And it was a Friday. After the Friday prayer, I saw Abdul Jalil. And I asked the person who knew him. He told me about what this person does. And what he does is really circulation. He's kind of going around different parts of the city, distributing food, helping young African children in Berkeley, inserted into community. And it's amazing that you go from mosque to mosque, he's moving like a Sufi, And I remembered that image after the LM event where we were taken to this, these Sufi events. Nowadays, these are more like touristic arrangements where you see these whirling dervishes. So I got the idea, yes, this is the Islamic moral economy. It's the symbolism. Of course, you have the whirling dervishes, and it's become more of an art form, a touristic form. But there is a symbolic significance of it, which is the idea of circulation, right? And that circulation is both in terms of charity, which is the most kind of invisible form of exchange, but it's also the image of tangible goods, which is trade. And in my humble opinion, these two central elements, of circulation, circulation of trade, the tangible goods, the circulation of credit, again tangible, and the circulation of charity, which is relatively intangible. You are not receiving anything in exchange of charity. But it tells you that there is another form of exchange, which is complementary, which is an exchange, as the Quran itself says, is exchange with Allah. You give money to the poor, you are in a sense trading with Allah. If you're giving charity, alms giving, it's a kind of invisible form of exchange. And these two, visible and invisible exchange, are interconnected. And the power of circulation in Islamic society is so huge that there were traders in Damascus who would trade in a way that they are really not earning any profit. But they would say, we have to be part of this circulation. We know the times are such that we are not earning any profit. It is cost to cost. But we are sitting in the middle of something. We are part of a larger system of circulation. So let things pass through us. That's the natural order of things. And that, to my mind, is one of the most fundamental principles of Islamic moral economy. And I want to use that example to actually take you to the development of commerce and credit in Mecca. Now, this is important because it connects with what I'm going to say about social justice. It's important because if you see Mecca's development over time in the pre-Prophet period, kind of pre-Islamic period, and of course, as a Muslim growing up, I read that story, Banu Hashim, Banu Umayyah, here are these different tribes, how are they dealing with each other? And then the Prophet of Islam arrives. Then he says, break all the idols, and then creates an Islamic society, moves to Medina, and then there is Fatah Makkah, all that. And, 25 years later, when I'm myself teaching political economy and I read that history again, and I say, oh, there's something actually deeper about this structure, about the arrival of Islam at that time, which is highly symbolic, because every universal system, you're from Germany, German philosophers or the European Enlightenment thinkers emphasized symbolism of things. Right? So in the same way, we have the particular development of Islam happened at a time when there are a lot of stories that are narrated to us, are stories as they appear on face of it, but they are symbols, they're invitations for us to think deeper and apply to our present times. So here is a slightly different reading, which of course I'm not the only one to present this reading. There are people like Mahmoud Ibrahim, there are lots of people who've looked at Makkah's development and the arrival of Islam in a mercantile society. Right? So we do know, for example, that Islam was born into a mercantile society. The Prophet himself was a trader, Khadija was a trader, Mecca itself was a trading center. All these things we know. But what we don't emphasize is the way in which there was a great deal of historical continuity in the way Islam developed. And the historical continuity was that prior to the advent of Islam, before the arrival of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, you had the development of commerce in Mecca. Mecca was emerging as a commercial center. And that commercial center was based on a number of important principles. There were a number of important institutional arrangements that were put in place even before the arrival of Islam. And I want to direct your attention to 3 or 4 of these institutional arrangements. One was the idea of the Kaaba, of course. The Kaaba was a sacred place. But remember, the kind of conceptualization of the sacred in Islam is intertwined with exchange, with these 2 forms of exchange that I have explained to you. The circulation of visible exchange, credit and capital commerce, credit, capital, commerce, this kind of visible exchange, and invisible exchange, the charity. And this is represented in the way Makkah's development as a sacred center before Islam coincided with an institutional practice of what we call haram. Haram was this area around Mecca which was considered sacred for traders. Your property and your trade goods are sacred there, right? And this was to be respected by everyone. The second key institutional practice at that time was because the traders were coming, they needed water, and water was available in Mecca, was sakaya. You give water to the pilgrims. This was a practice. And then rifada, which is you feed the traders who are coming through, right? And the pilgrims themselves. Over time, obviously, commerce was increasing, and these 3 institutions, the institution of haram and rifada, sakaya, these were important for creating an institutional space, almost like if you read about champagne fairs in Europe, the development of champagne fairs. Long before that, you have these development of a sort of sacred fair where the property and the goods of the traders was protected. And they were given services. And at the same time, there was also something called the sadaqah, which was at that time intertribal, not intra-tribal. So within the tribe, you give to the poorer members of society. And a final instrument that was very important was hilf, which is the agreements, which became ilaf. These are the different kinds of agreements that were arrived. And the idea was that in the development of Makkah's emergence as a trading center, a crucial moment arrived when the Quraysh took over the reins of Mecca. And they agreed with Syria. They used to trade with Syria at that time. And the head of the Quraysh actually visited Banu Hashim. He visited Syria and made a series of agreements that, our traders will come, you'll protect them, we'll bring goods that you need, and along the way we will buy and sell. That was a very, very important institutional practice in the political economy of Mecca before the arrival of Islam. Because this created a new economy of ilaf, which is mutual agreements. Think about it as a free trade agreement in the modern sense of the word. These are kind of trading agreements. So what you do essentially is you create a new market. It's the political economy of market access. You create a new market. So within Mecca, you provide security of property, new distributional instruments, and outside Mecca, you actually create a new market by creating a series of tribal agreements, which were basically negotiating easy passage of goods. That's the economy of Ilaf that was created on the way. On top of that, there was another very important practice that the Quraysh introduced, which was that previously, if you want to be part of a trading operation, you're taking your goods to Syria, to Damascus, you need a lot of capital, and only those who have capital could participate in it. What the Quraysh did was to say, well, if you are a small merchant, or if you are poor, or if you have limited resources, you could still be partner in that trade. you could share the profit in that trade. Invest in caravan trade and share in the profits of it. So this is critically important for those who are interested in Islamic economics and finance, because that's where some of these practices are coming from. These were the sort of practices that created the institutional basis for the expansion of trade, of the emergence of Mecca as an important trading hub. And these were the institutional practices that predated Islam. In that milieu came Islam. Prophet Muhammad entered in that milieu. But something else was happening by the time the Prophet of Islam was born and when he was given prophethood at the age of 40. Before then, what you see is that with the growing wealth in Mecca, because Mecca was now emerging as a big trading center, and a lot of merchants were important, there was a third type of circulation which was important. And this was the circulation of people, labor. Because as the economy becomes more differentiated, you need servicemen, you need slaves, you need people who are not members of the clans. There are people coming and going. And this development, both the growth of luxurious living and the growth of commerce and trade led to a greater concentration of wealth and the greater circulation of labor. And remember, this is a time when you are protected only if you are from a particular tribe or you are from a tribe that has an ilaf with your tribe. So you see the development of this class of labor within society that is unprotected. These were the early slaves who, if you see Muhammad movie, right, you see Bilal, you see a lot of other slaves who are, who were tortured, and they were some of the first people who actually accepted and came into the fold of Islam. The development of this class of people who were unprotected again created social tensions within Mecca. So you see, at the time of the arrival of Islam in Meccan polity and economy, you had both growing concentration of capital, growing economic concentration, you had a development of a class of labor that was unprotected, and you had intra-elite competition. So a lot of tribes clans started to fight each other. So you could see that a lot of the institutions that protected this trade, the hilf, the ilaf, the sakaya, and sadaqah, right? A lot of these institutions, rifada, these were not sufficient now with the stage of institutional development that this society was going through. And in one way, with the arrival of Islam, you do not see these practices totally abandoned. You see a great deal of historical continuity. What you see in institutional economics terms, this was a move from a limited access order to an open access order. Because a lot of these tools, institutional practices, were available and were defined on the basis of clans, right? If you are part of a clan, you will get protection. Within society, you would receive sadaqah if you are a member of that clan, right? And whole range of these practices were limited. So a clan-based, tribal-based social order was insufficient to support the development of Mecca as a trading center and to deal with the growing inequities that resulted as a part of that commercial development. So with the Prophet's arrival, you could see that a lot of these practices became institutionalized, and their ambit was from a localized segment. It became a universal component of human brotherhood, where you open the gates of cooperation not based on what tribe you are, right, or on what god or what idol you obey, but actually based on monotheism. And that's my second important point, because it brings to this very important idea of social justice, which is that this whole idea about Tawheed or monotheism is a very, very important component for social justice. As a child or somebody growing up, we've always seen, you say, well, this is fine. I mean, you say there's only one, no God, but at least but one God, and Prophet Muhammad is the final prophet, and you do it almost in a habitual way. But if you look at the implications of the concept of Tawheed and understand it within the context of this Meccan society, right, where there was a hierarchical growth of commerce and the emergence of a hierarchical society, a tribal-based system that tried to create alliances, but which were available only to within-group members or members of the group that have alliances with you. It opened the scope of these institutions to a much larger scale of society, of human society. And of course, the circulation of labor is important because you read any European philosopher, if you read any civilization, no civilization is based without migration. Give me any example of a civilizational order that has been achieved without migration, without the intermingling of communities, the intermingling of different societies. So, why was monotheism in this particular context a revolutionary statement? Of course, it was a revolutionary statement because by demolishing all the idols, what Islam effectively did was to say all these idols, they are going to be demolished. And you surrender to one God, which means all other hierarchies in the world are not to be obeyed. Right? So, by accepting one God, you accept everyone in the world. Because God is to be seen through His people. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what Ali Shariati talks about, the idea of Al-Nas, which is a very unique, distinct way of addressing people in the Quran, which again is linked with this whole idea about monotheism. And Adl or justice is a fundamental component of Tawheed, right? It's a component of this monotheistic system. And what I'm going to say is that monotheism itself is a distributive claim. It's a non-hierarchical claim. It's a revolutionary claim. We live with it, we grow with it as Muslims, but actually it's an act of revolution, monotheism itself. And it's because the shirk itself is duality. You live your life, but you accept the evil, immoral order that rules the society, right? Now, in this context, what's important is that this whole idea of monotheism is, of course, also linked with the idea of unity of existence, that Allah is manifest through many different things, right? So the people here from so many different parts of the world, they're all different shades of the divine, right? And so you seek the divine through His makhluk, through people, through His people, right? Men and women. And so you create a harmonious social order, and you, by accepting a monotheistic framework, you accept no hierarchy based on class, color, creed, religion, but except for the hierarchy of God. So it's a truly, truly revolutionary statement in its own right. And that's why the concept of An-Nas, which the Quran at many occasions engages with it, the idea of An-Nas, is the masses, is the people. Because the only fundamental factor of social change in Islam are the masses, the people. And you would see lots of ahadith where the Prophet of Islam says, oh, I was sick, you didn't visit me. Allah is saying to the person, I was poor, you did not give me food. I was thirsty, you didn't give me water. I was a musafir and you didn't take care of me. And who is it? Because Allah you cannot see, but it's Allah's people. So in other words, your relationship with Allah is partly mediated through your relationship with people, His people in the world. You take care of them, you're taking care of Allah. And that's why, when the Quran says you feed a poor, right, or when you give money to a poor person, in a sense, it is the best kind of money you're giving to God. Right? So, by accepting the supremacy of Allah, you're actually accepting the supremacy of humanity. Right? Through the many shades through which Allah or the divine order is reflected. So, that is why it is not surprising that at a time when the Prophet emerged in Arabia, he said, La Qaisar la Kisra. Right? There were empires, the Roman and the Caesar was there, the Persians were there. All those orders are become secondary. The only order is the one of Allah. So you could see that in the very birth of Islam, you could see the seeds of the emergence of a non-hierarchical social order. The only two forms of hierarchy that are important in this context, and which are not the hierarchies that I or you can build, is the hierarchy in the eyes of God is based on knowledge and piety. Ilm and taqwa. Right? So, beyond these two, ranks, which again are to be determined by none other than Allah Himself, it's no other rank actually. So it's a really important claim about equality. This is monotheistic claim. And this, by the way, is not the first time. If you think about Abraham and the way in which he destroyed idols, Moses, where he raised the clarion call of monotheism against pharaohs, pharaonic order. Jesus, when he rose against the Jewish priesthood, all of these examples are examples where monotheism is creating a framework for human cooperation that goes above tribe, that goes above hierarchy, that creates a platform for equality. Right? There's a very interesting book, I forget the name of the author, it's called Big Gods, for a Lebanese writer. How monotheism creates a big cooperative space. And these big gods are, the gods of monotheism. Right? It's the monotheism as a frame where you go above your blood descent, your color, the location you are, and gives you a truly global, human, universal outlook, and creates the platform for you to cooperate. And this is indeed true if you think about trade, which I think, again, is the centrality of trade for this social justice. I don't think, and I'm going to explain in due course, you can create a just social order in present-day Muslim societies without creating a new trading order. Because you might already be thinking, all of what I described about Mecca today, if you look at Mecca's role now, is the same pagan role. Pagan role. It's the same, it's the return to the days of the Jahiliyyah. You cannot trade there, you cannot have the normal circulation. All the circulation you could see is only the symbolic circulation around Mecca. You do not see the substantive circulation of capital, of goods, of invisible exchange that you require. So, monotheism, in other words, creates a domain of independence, free will. Even when Rumi was asked, what is trust, right? And Allah says that man is the vice regent on earth. Yes, we own the property, but first is Allah owns the property, and then we are the trustee. Or if I am a professor at the University of Oxford, if I am teaching, I am the trustee of the knowledge that Allah has given me, right? So everything we own is kind of conditional on that. So that freedom requires a sort of independence but interdependence. Because monotheism creates independence, a free soul who is not going to be submit to any amoral, immoral social order, unjust social order. And at the same time, I am interdependent because my independence comes through interdependence. Human beings, through trade, through circulation of people, circulation of capital. It's that interdependence that creates independence, right? So these are, this is a subject that we could talk for the whole day about monotheism, but I wanted to say you cannot talk about social justice unless you talk about Tawheed, which I think is a very important aspect, because compared to the theory of Rawls and kind of Enlightenment thinkers, Michael Sandel, the Islamic framework for social justice starts at the level of consciousness. It's very primordial. Right? I mean, these days, a lot of research on behavioral economics, on behavioral psychology. Islam principles of social justice operate at the very level of your mind, in the cognitive domain, at the level of consciousness. And that's a much important, much starker, way of dealing with the issues of social justice. And of course, when you think about the cognitive domain, it's important for us because the world we live in today is, knowingly or unknowingly, you are participating in a social order, right? You're using mobile phones, you're in an organization, you are working in it. There's a politics of knowledge behind things, right? How do you create an independent soul? Because knowingly or unknowingly, we are part of a social order. And so the first thing for you to do is to be independent and to realize that monotheistic claim in your personality first. And for that, the first thing to recognize is that throughout, the nature of universe is such that it's one of opposites. If you want to live, you have to die during your life. You have to recognize and embrace death during your life. Then it really opens the frame for living. It's what Ibn al-Arabi used to say, die before you die. If you want to gain in life, you have to embrace loss, failure for success, winter for some, to appreciate the summer. And in the same way, the invisible exchange in the world of Islam is an exchange where, for example, Mawlana Rum says, you give in order to receive. So you feed your body by providing it food. You feed your soul by feeding others. So it's the form of exchange, and this is at the level of consciousness, that you see that you will be empty unless you relate with the other. So this is the level of consciousness where the logic is inverted. The same, we are going to enter into the month of Ramadan. Ramadan itself is a revolutionary act, because in the middle of all the consumerism, we say, La, no, I will not eat. I will deny all the pleasures. And that gives you freedom. That gives you resilience. Because the world is the one of opposites. Right? And so there is a world within us that we want to fill in. And so in order to receive, that's the invisible exchange I talked about in the beginning of the lecture, is where you actually give in order to receive. That's the biggest magic of charity. It's the economy of circulation. You go to any big shrine, Sufi shrine in Africa or in South Asia, come war or hunger or any other time, you always have food there. Now, I might be presenting a more Sufi perspective. I'm not necessarily Sufi myself, but I'm just taking those imageries to see, because the Sufis in some ways kind of try to symbolize those elements. But those elements are there. They're essential core of Sharia, right? Of the way you need to distribute resources. And at the conscientious level, every monotheistic religion has tried to create a just equitable and fair disposition, whether it's Buddhism or Islam or Judaism, Christianity. The least common denominator of all of these religions is that you treat others the way you would like to be treated yourself. You cannot be a Muslim, good Muslim, without it. This is a claim for social justice. Right? And it operates at the level of your conscience. It's much more powerful. Because, in order to get taxes from the rich and give them to the poor, think about the problems that we find in the US or even in many developing countries where the rich are not able to pay, right? There are a whole range of troubles in creating that sort of bargain. But in Islam, as indeed in many other great religions, you start from the level of conscience, right? And to create a system where you actually help the others for helping yourself. And that is why, giving to others is a way of enlightened self-interest. That is indeed why in mainstream economics, whether it's the assumption of rationality or the assumption of altruism, that people are altruistic by nature, the way economics, some of the basic assumptions of economics are being revised are inspired by this idea that there is something called the enlightened self-interest. People do derive value by engaging with others, by giving to others. Samuel Bowles' work, for example, Amartya Sen's work, Raghuram Rajan's forthcoming book is on politics and markets, and then he says communities. Nobody used to talk about communities in mainstream economics. People are talking about it. All of this, a couple of days back, all the CEOs in the US came together, some of the major CEOs, and said, well, the capitalist system is not working. We need to give money to the poor. We need to change the system. It's not good for us. We recognize we are capitalists. We will lose. Why? Because of enlightened self-interest. And that's why Prophet Muhammad said, by trying to establish a moral and just order, you are helping the oppressor and the oppressed. And it's your duty to do so. There is no way you could be silent in this. And in fact, if you think about the very meaning of the words, the adl itself is like balance, right? The whole proportion, balance, fairness, equity. And the zulm is the exact opposite of it, right? It's a system in which you oppress. And in this system, you cannot be silent. Otherwise, you would be a muawin, you are a collaborator. And in fact, that gave me an entirely different perspective in which to read this hadith, that, if you see something that is objectionable, you should try and stop it. If not, say it, or if not, at least think about it. And I feel that the most powerful application of it is in terms of the larger moral and political economy order that we have. Think about the people of Algiers. All of them, the biggest problem of collective action is for people to come together. Once everybody came together, the system came down. If you operate at the level of consciousness and create that consciousness, and that's where the education system is critical. If it creates independent, free souls, what Ibn Khaldun University's motto says, istiqlal al-fikri, right? The independence of thought. If you're truly independent, which the capitalist system is not producing independent people. We are dependent on our needs. We are driven by our craving. We are driven by what others think of us, right? So the inculcation of a truly free soul is important for creating a just society. Because then you would have a natural tendency for people to aspire for a moral and economic order that is non-hierarchical, and where people oppose to the level they can oppose. They at least think that this is not the right order. Neutrality or submission to an unjust order is not allowed. And this is important because oppression leads to the destruction of societies. Right? And that's why, as I said, whenever a society can be based on kufr, but it cannot be based on zulm. It cannot be based on injustice. Injustice will destroy the society. And that's why there is no space for you to be neutral in that system. Because if you're neutral, you're participating in that unjust moral order. Now, this is hugely empowering. If you were to give this perspective to somebody studying social movements or sociology, or how societies produce collective action. In Germany, for example, the Green movement is very powerful. People talk about civic society, civil society. Well, here you have a very, very powerful manifesto for a civil society that will not submit but to the rule of God. And, for example, and again, we have to recognize that, of course, there are lots of ways in which even the religion is used to subjugate people to the same immoral social order, right? So that is why, in the Quran, for example, there is a beautiful quote: "It is those who believe and confuse not their beliefs with oppression." Because sometimes you can confuse your beliefs with oppression. You're believing something, but you're creating an oppressive state. That are truly in security. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, said, "If you are my ummah, don't be afraid to say to the oppressors, you are oppressor." Right? And if you don't say this, Allah will desert you. Right? So, similarly, the Prophet of Islam said, how could Allah bless people who do not ensure the rights of the weak or the oppressed from the harsh? So this is where the true struggle of human society between good and evil, between a moral and immoral order, is important, as important for everyone. That's the level of justice, a high level of sensitivity that Islam tries to operate from. Now, of course, in this context, if you think about this whole framework, you're thinking about monotheism as a distributive claim, as a claim for freedom, as a claim for a non-hierarchical social order, as a claim for true sovereignty, right? The sovereignty of the people, right? That they are not subjugated to any unjust social order. Now, from that, I'm going to talk a little bit about, what the, in this particular framework, the way in which state-society relationship is going. Within this framework, the individual is free, but it's a conditional freedom. It's a freedom, it's independence that requires interdependence. As I said, there's no independence without interdependence. And therefore, you need to create what Martin Buber, the famous Jewish philosopher, talked about, the I-it relationship. You are an individual, you have particularistic identity, but you discover yourself by engaging with others, by being part of the community. If you're not part of the community, you lose yourself. Right? So there are both of these ends, your own individuality and the society. And that's why, if you think about property rights in Islam, if you think about ownership of assets in Islam, it's all conditional. If you are ruling, it's all conditional. Which is, in an economic perspective, no right is absolute. No pattern of ownership is absolute. It's all conditional. And what is it conditional on? It's conditional on externalities, whether it creates positive externalities or negative externalities. Which is to say, whether it is good for society as a whole or it is negative for society. Okay, and that's very important aspect of this equation. Now, in this particular framework, of course, the perspective I've given you of social justice is the perspective that is a lot more than what a typical text on Islamic economics and finance will talk about. Because a typical text would typically talk about, yes, social justice is very important, and then after a few pages you will move very quickly to sadaqah and zakat and all of these instruments, waqf. These are very important instruments, institutional practices that were conducted. But again, these were practices that laid the seeds for distribution, for a society where you do not want perfect equality. You recognize the inherent differences amongst individuals, but you are constantly catering to the needs, constantly trying to create a balance. It's like Goldilocks equilibrium. It's an equilibrium where there's, you have to keep a constant balance. In the same way as in Mecca, you had the commercial development, but economic concentration, exploitation, and decay of the clan-based system emerged. You needed to restore that balance, and Islam created the universal framework for that. Even after the arrival of Islam, it's a constant struggle to create that system which maintains that balance. Because in every society, as the economy grows, as commercial development takes place, there are natural tendencies for accumulation of capital, right? And you need to constantly struggle for that. In other words, what I'm trying to aim at is that there's something called the more dynamic notion of social justice, which would need to be tailored to the individual needs of society. And what do I mean by that? Think about property rights. We know the property rights, for example, in the very early days of Islam, during the times of the Prophet, if you are engaging in a war and a lot of land comes under your control, you distribute it to the soldiers. And the first time this was a prophetic practice, but Umar ibn Khattab deviated from that practice. Because at that time, all of Iraq and Sham came into the fold of the Muslim rule. And a lot of his associates were quite alarmed and said, why would you depart from the prophetic practice? And he said, look, come together, I will give you a reasoning. If you would agree with it, first listen to what I have to say. And they said, okay. He said, look, at the time of the Prophet, it was only a small tract of land that came in the possession. Now it's all of Iraq and all of Sham. You're talking about very rich agricultural regions. There are tenants in these regions who know best how to protect that property and how to cultivate. If you bring it to centralized control, you might lose food security. So there's a question about food security. The second thing you talked about was that, well, you would give it to the soldiers today. What will you do tomorrow? If I do this now, it will become a continuous practice. And, this cannot be continued. So there's a question about, and essentially he was talking about intergenerational equity. Then he also talked about how the distribution of this land to soldiers would prevent the development of fiscal capacity, because now we need to create army that could be paid. You need a fiscal base for it, and for that you need to tax land so that you can build an army. And his fourth justification was that actually if you were to distribute land to these soldiers, you would create a class of people who would consider it. And this was appealing to people. They said, yes, that's fine. Here is an example where the ownership of property, and remember, the ownership of property is there's huge sanctity in Islam, right? If you read the international country risk guides about expropriation of property or expropriation of somebody's land and wealth, it's considered haram. It's the life and property of other Muslims is an inviolable right? You cannot violate that. Yet it was allowed to depart from the prophetic practice for the ownership. That what I'm trying to emphasize is that there was a dynamic conception of social justice, which was not rigid in its time. It was active. This is clearly very important from the perspective of contemporary Muslim societies, because post-colonial rule, after the arrival of colonizer, right, a lot of Muslim world was under the yoke of colonization. And during that time, the property rights were interfered with. The moment colonizer left, there was demand for land reforms. In Iran, in Turkey, a whole range of places, there were land reforms. In Egypt, for example, in Morocco, other places. Morocco limited, but still, you had a large number of Muslim countries. And this created an active discourse amongst Muslims of, okay, whether land distribution, in principle, under Islam, you cannot take away anybody's property. But is it right to take property? And a very good site for this debate was actually Pakistan. Because there, much of the land was held by a very small number of families. And the moment the question of land reforms came, all the ulama were brought together and they said, look, under Islam, you cannot take away the property. But of course, much of this property was not the result of hard work. It was patronage. It was given by the colonial master to create a pliant class. So here you see the way in which the law and its application and political economy came into play. And in the Pakistani context, for example, the ulama all said land reform azru-e shara haram. It's not, in fact, there was an association called tahaffuz-e zamindara as shariat, according to Sharia, protection of these large landed estates according to Sharia. And there was associations. Now, you could see as a political economist today, the Pakistani polity, unless you have a more fairer distribution of land, you cannot get rid of the same elite that gets recycled again and again into parliaments. And this question came to the Supreme Court. And there was active discussion amongst religious scholars. And in the end, in the 1980s, they ruled that land reform is un-Islamic. Right? Now, this again reinforces the importance to reinvent these principles constantly. This reinforces the importance of thinking about social justice in an active, dynamic way, because sometimes you can use religious injunctions in the same way as this quote that I said, where you could confuse the religion to oppress people. So that's an important aspect of social justice. And what I would like to end with, because I think I've already exceeded 40 minutes, is that any claim about the circulation of capital and credit is a highly politically charged notion. It's an important notion of political economy. Because remember, if you think about the spread of Islam from North Africa to East Asia to Indonesia, trade played an inherently important role in this whole sphere, right? And what trade did was it disrupted existing modes of politics. It disrupted geopolitical control. And it was apparent in the time of Mecca as well, Mecca's initial development, because there are a lot of attacks that Mecca faced from neighboring regions. And of course, the geopolitical control was important. It's manifested today in the way in which the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative and the American and Western opposition to it in one way or another. It's about two competing versions of globalization. Right? And so trade is a hugely powerful component of this. It's a political economy claim. In a sense, Turkey is the best example of it. Right? You have historically the concentration of economic power in Ankara, Istanbul, Izmir, and from there gradually you saw the economic power shifting to the Anatolian hinterlands. And that was not just a shift in economic power, it created new political patterns, new forms of sovereignty, economic sovereignty. And it also asserted itself in the geopolitical domain. And I think this institutional dimension of social justice, or the debates on social justice, is very, very important. Because much of the Islamic economics and finance literature creates what I call the institutional sufficiency of zakat and sadaqah and waqf. Here are these three instruments. They're good starting points. But you have to relate it to this whole moral framework of Tawheed, about the larger social structure. And that's where I think, if you think about a political economy perspective of social justice, you ought to start with Ibn Khaldun. And you ought to end with the present struggle for social justice in the Muslim world. And this is where I will end. So let me begin with Khaldunian notion of social justice. Ibn Khaldun was important in the sense that he, in his Muqaddimah, he created a new perspective where he linked justice with, for example, contracts. He said, if you are, even in Islam, if you look at usury, if you look at the usurious exchange in the Prophet's time or before he came, peace be upon him, usury was a way of social dislocation because people's freedom was being appropriated, right? Because you will go into debt, you will leave your family, your original social structure would be gone. And in many ways in the capitalist system you see similar social alienation from the family, alienation from your identity, right? There is alienation that is built into it, which was part of usury. And similarly, the principle of gharar, for example, asymmetric exchange, where you have uncertain exchange. It's huge uncertainty about where your gains are unearned and losses are undeserved, right? This is an important part of social justice. So in the Khaldunian concept too, when he emphasized the decay of Muslim societies, Muslim dynasties, he talks about luxurious living, but he places justice in the ruler-merchant relationship, which is interesting. Not a lot of scholars have actually studied this. There needs to be work on this aspect, where he talked about how rulers subjugate the commercial classes, the merchants, through unpredictable and inconsistent behavior. They either favor people or disfavor them. And this is hugely important from contemporary perspective, right? You're from Syria. In Syria, there is a famous saying, you're either with Makhluf or you're against the law. Rami Makhluf is one of the president's cousins. And so you either, or in Algeria, you have the statement where you say, you're either with us or I decimate you. And this happened with the Khalifa Bank. Khalifa Bank was set up by one of the insiders of the system. His uncle was an intelligence person. He set up banking institution, and then lots of other institutions. And it was seen as a threat to political power. It was demolished. So the rule of the day today is that you either partner or perish. This is my one-liner. I mean, in Morocco, for example, the WikiLeaks showed how all the decisions about the real estate, for example, are taken by 3 people in the Makhzar. They decide where real estate deals. This is one of the highest forms of injustice that we see in Muslim societies, which the Khaldunian notion alerts us to and has huge, tremendous relevance, because Khaldun said, if you do not create a level playing field for traders, you're taking away all forms of livelihood. You're taking all forms of social mobility from people. You're creating a domain that is not a level playing field. With the result that you create a system where the government dominates and you're not free individual. You cannot speak up because your job will be gone. You're not truly independent. Your politics and economics, your overall political economy will not be independent. So this has huge contemporary relevance. And I haven't seen many scholars who've actually related social justice with ruler-merchant relationship in such an active and dynamic way. Because you talked about contracts, he talks about the way government controls and creates monopolies, he talks about the creation of a merchant class that is connected at the top, but there are no, if you look at all across the Middle East, the firms can survive either you are very close to the state or you are very far from the state. Close to the state means one of the crony capitalists. And far from the state, those people who are informal, micro firms who do not want to be seen by the government. So actually, the very construction of contemporary political order in the Middle East is based on injustice. And an injustice in the economic domain is high. There's a very high level of injustice at the economic domain, right? And that's clear from all the people who are bringing out these posters in Algiers who were saying Nizam, we want to change the Nizam. They're talking about injustice, right? Because the Islamic conception of injustice as well talks about life, property, dignity of human beings. If you look at what the protesters on the street in Algeria are coming out and saying, and in Sudan, dignity is the dignity of the human beings that has been subjugated. So, one can talk a great deal about it, but I feel if I were to sum up the different threads that I've opened here, one thread that I've opened is that we need to think afresh about the way in which the very religious construction, the religious system of Islam, from Tawheed, from the historical development of Mecca as a sacred center, and that sacred center was intertwined, was integral to trading. So trade is almost as sacred as Mecca. It's co-constituted. Today, you cannot create a moral and just political economy order in the Middle East unless you create a new trading order in the Middle East. Right? Because that is the trading order that will create that level of cooperation, commitment, trust, mutuality. And this, by the way, if you read Fernand Braudel, the great European philosopher, who said trade is a cooperative exercise, is the linchpin of civilization. But the problem with trade is that trade disrupts existing political orders. Trade disrupts geopolitical orders. And so for you to say that you could have trade really as part of a zero-sum game is not possible. Today, if you were to say that Arab countries could trade a lot with each other, neither the rulers nor the international system would easily permit that, because it would just disrupt the system. So that was one thread of my presentation. The other thread was at the level of consciousness and realizing the fundamental importance of Tawheed, of a monotheistic framework. And finally, to talk about the political economy aspect of social justice, where the institutional self-sufficiency of zakat, sadaqah, waqf is not enough. You need to rethink the whole moral economy framework. And to think about, because we are in a stage where directly or indirectly, knowing or unknowingly, we are driven by the larger system. And the struggle between good and evil, of staying on the straight and narrow path, is partly to ask yourself, are you a co-worker of God? Are you part of that larger monotheistic frame which creates the framework for human cooperation? Or you are part of a system that exploits, that subjugates, that creates inequality, that accumulates at the expense of misery, that creates patterns of exploitation, sustains them militarily, economically, psychologically. And that's a struggle where you cannot be neutral. You have to take a side.